Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at a new mini PC. This one's called the MinisForum UM780 XTX. And yes, that's totally a mouthful. Now, this is very similar to other mini PCs I've reviewed earlier this year. In fact, the chipset and specs are almost identical. However, there are some unique aspects to it, first and foremost being an OCulink port. And this is really exciting for me because it's the first mini PC I've seen that actually has this functionality, which we will test in this video. So we're going to take a deep dive review into this mini PC, and I think by the end you will agree that this is one of the best top-end mini PC options we have on the market today. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, let's start with the pricing. Now there's a bare bones model option, which means it won't come with RAM or hard drive, you'll have to install that yourself. And the pricing here is $479. Now, if you want a more plug-and-play experience, and you'd rather have them add the RAM and the storage, then it's going to be $629 for the spec model that I'm reviewing here today. And they've been upgrading those internal components just across the board, so you can see right here, we're getting 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. And that is double of what you'll usually get with some of these base models. And if you'd like, you can bump the RAM up even more to 64 gigabytes. Personally, I don't think that's really going to be worth it unless you're going to be using this as a workstation. When it comes to gaming and all the tests we'll be doing here today, 32 gigabytes is plenty. Another unique thing about this specific mini PC, it's the first MinisForum model I've seen that comes in different colorways. In addition to the champagne color that you can see here, they've also got a blue and a black color option. The review unit that they sent over to me is black, but I kind of like the champagne one. I think that's the one I would have preferred. Let's do a quick look at the specs. Like I mentioned before, there's not a huge difference between this and other mini PCs I've reviewed before. For example, its CPU is the Ryzen 7 7840HS. This is essentially the desktop version of the 7840U chip that you're probably familiar with a bunch of the handhelds that have come out this year. And right now, the Ryzen 7000 series APUs, like in this mini PC, are kind of the standards for most handhelds as well as mini PCs, at least the top end. And this has integrated graphics, the Radeon 780M. Again, this is kind of standard for many of the mini PCs and the handhelds we've seen on the market. However, one thing to bear in mind is that in comparison to similar handhelds, this can perform a lot better because it's not going to be constrained by size and heat, which means that you can give it a higher power profile. In fact, the profile we'll be using here in this video is 70 watts. And there's no handheld that can get close to that in terms of power performance. Now this comes with dual channel DDR5 RAM and it's clocked at 5600 megahertz. And the rest of the components are going to be pretty standard. So Wi-Fi 6E, HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 1.4, and of course, like I mentioned before, the OCulink port. And of note, this also has two full USB 4 ports capable of a 40 gigabit transfer speed. Okay, usually at this point of the video, I will do an unboxing and talk about all the things that you get inside. Now, unfortunately, I lost my footage. I recorded all this great footage. It would have been the best you'd ever seen. I even did a really great butter comparison. But unfortunately, I deleted that footage. I cannot find it. I spent half a day looking for it, and finally I just gave up. So instead, we're just going to show you all the components that come with it, but we're not going to do a full unboxing. And also bear in mind that this is after a couple weeks of testing, so some of this stuff might look a little banged up. Either way, let's start with the power supply. So it's a full 120 watts, and it is relatively small. On the power side, it's just a standard Mickey Mouse style cable, and then on the brick side, we've got a barrel plug. Anyway, it's relatively small for the amount of wattage that we're getting here, and it's the first one I've seen with the MinisForum brand on it. Additionally, we've got an HDMI cable, and then also an instruction manual. And this one's pretty standard. It'll show you all the different components and show you how to take it apart if you'd like. It also comes with a VESA mount if you want to hook it up to the back of a monitor. It also comes with a stand. I'll show you how to put that together here in a moment. And then finally, it also comes with this unique etched tiger logo thing. But essentially, this will allow you to show various designs inside of your mini PC by virtue of the RGB lights that are already in here. Before we get to that, let's take a look at the mini PC itself. Starting from the left to the right, we have a CMOS reset button, then a microphone headphone input, and then one of our two USB 4 ports. After that, we have two USB-A 3.2 Gen 2 ports, and then finally our power button. On the sides, there's nothing really special other than a lot of ventilation, and so let's take a look at the back. This one also has cooling both above and below the board, and in terms of I/O, we've got another two USB-A 3.2 Gen 2, and another USB 4. And these USB cables are capable of video out, but we also have DisplayPort 1.4 and HDMI 2.1. So in all, you have 4 different video output options with this mini PC. Next, we have an OCulink port, which will allow us to use an external GPU if you have one with this connection. And then after that, we have dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. And finally, we have our power plug input. Not a lot on the bottom other than 2 screw holes, which are going to be for our VESA mount as well as our stand. And one final thing to note, on the top, the MinisForum logo is actually to the left side when you're looking at it straight on. And that's to accommodate it when you put it in the stand, that way the text is going to be right side up, since that's when you're going to be seeing the logo the most. Now the top itself is just magnetic, so you don't need any tools to get inside, but if you want to get further in and look at the components, you do have to use a Phillips head screwdriver. So let's go ahead and do that. There are 4 screws at the very edges, and it will be connected to a couple different cables. One is actually a fan up top, and this is to remove heat from the RAM as well as the SSD modules. And as you can see here, there's a lot of cooling within here. Not only is there a fan, but there's a big heatsink as well. Now internally, you can see there are 2 different M.2 slots. One is going to be for our 1TB Kingston module, and we're going to use the second one for our OCulink port. In addition, you can see the RAM module up top, and these ones also have their own heatsink, so they're really pushing it pretty hard to make sure that the RAM and the SSD do not overheat. And the brand of RAM that I got here is Crucial, but it may be different in the actual retail models. Now one thing I wasn't able to show because I lost my unboxing footage is that this does not come with the OCulink pre-installed. And that's because it requires an M.2 slot, and so they give you the option right here where you can essentially put your own additional storage in, or they do give you an M.2 OCulink module. And so this is a very simple setup. You would just remove the M.2 screw, put the module inside, and then tighten down the screw. At that point, the OCulink hole in the back is going to sync up with the connector. And just like that, you've now created an OCulink port on your mini PC. However, one thing to bear in mind with this process, that means you won't have additional storage options. There's no SATA drive connector, so you can't add a 2.5-inch drive. There's really no room for it. And of course, you'll be using the additional M.2 slot for your OCulink port. So right off the bat, that's probably one of my biggest complaints about this, is that you are a little bit limited in your additional storage options. Either way, once you put it together, as you can see on the back, we now have our full OCulink port, which we will be testing here in a moment. Before we get to that, let's go ahead and check out the stand that comes with it. It is going to be unassembled, so you have to put it together yourself. And it's pretty simple. It's just 2 screws to attach it together. And then you just want to add those 2 additional screws on the back. Now these screws don't go in all the way, so the stand itself is actually going to be somewhat loose. It's really one of those kind of setups where the screws are sticking out a little bit and then you will just slot it into the case. And so this will be nice if you're looking for something where you want a small footprint on your desk and you don't mind it being a little bit taller. And like I mentioned, when using an orientation like this, it'll make the MinisForum logo look right side up. And so here's a look at a typical mini PC setup. I've got my power plug at the bottom, then an Ethernet cable, HDMI out to the monitor, and then also using that USB 4 port, I've plugged in an external hard drive. This is what I'm going to be using to store all of my games. And finally on the back, I'm using my 2 USB ports. One of them is for the controller and its stand, and the other is a 2.4 GHz connector for my keyboard. And finally up front, I'm also using a USB port for my 2.4 GHz mouse. So yeah, I think that's going to be a pretty typical setup if you are going to have a mini PC like this. Now, in addition to the review unit mini PC, they also sent out this keyboard for review. Apparently, MinisForum is now getting into the mechanical keyboard business. And I've been testing it for a couple weeks. It's pretty solid. It is a 75% keyboard, and it is a full height and uses red mechanical switches. Anyway, this is not a full keyboard review, and they kind of sent this out to me unsolicited, so if you want to read more about it, you can see it on their website. But of note, it is $100, and it also comes in 3 different colorways. And I think in terms of standard pre-built mechanical keyboard stuff, it's got all the features you're probably looking for. Anyway, back to the mini PC, let's talk a little bit more about that RGB lighting. If we pull off that magnetic cover, you can see that I have the little tiger logo inside. And they said they're going to be offering other logos in the future, but I haven't seen any on their website yet. Now you can also just put the cover back on without any sort of logo, but you're going to get this really bright RGB square. And I don't know, you might think this is cool, but personally I find it a little bit distracting. Now thankfully within the BIOS, they have an option to turn this off, and it's very easy to do. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. First, you need to restart your computer and then tap on the delete button until the BIOS menu shows up. And MinisForum's actually made their own custom BIOS menu, which is pretty easy to navigate. Now, unfortunately, the text is kind of hard to read because it's like a light blue, but hopefully you can follow along. Essentially, all you have to do is go into the advanced settings, and then under onboard devices setting, there's an option at the bottom that says RGB LED. From here, all you have to do is just change it from enabled to disabled, and it's going to turn it right off. And that's it, you're now good to go. It's not going to turn those lights on again. Now, if you're going to be using this as a gaming PC like me, there's one other option I recommend changing. And that's also going to be under the advanced menu, but it's going to be under power configuration. By default, it'll be in balance mode, which will give you a 65 watt power profile, but we're going to change it to performance mode. This is going to bump it all the way up to 70 watts. And so all my testing is going to be done in this performance mode. Anyway, that's it. Now you can select Save and Exit Setup, and you'll be booted back into Windows 11 Home. So now let's do a couple benchmark tests. We'll start with Cinebench so we can test CPU performance. Right off the bat, you can see that that the idle CPU power is around 5 watts, and it's very cool, about 32 degrees Celsius. And so now let's start the 10-minute Cinebench test to see how it performs. Right off the bat, you can see that the power profile goes all the way up to a full 70 watts, and within a couple minutes, it really starts to work that CPU. Now, while this is working at a full 100% load, let's go ahead and do a sound test. And this will be really informal. I'm just going to push my camera right up to the mini PC, and then I'm also going to press on an Xbox button at the same time so you can get an idea of the comparative volume. So overall, I would say that this is not a super quiet fan. It's definitely something you'll hear under a full load, but it's still relatively quiet for being a full-scale PC and much quieter than pushing on buttons on an Xbox controller. So overall, I would say that yes, it does get quite loud, but nothing like a full desktop PC. Now going back to our Cinebench test as it starts to wind down, you can see that number one, it maintained a full 70 watts the entire time, so no throttling. And you can also see that the max temperature was very low. It never got higher than 79 degrees Celsius. Generally, I'm just happy if it stays under 90, but the fact that it stayed under 80, especially at a 70 watt load, is really impressive for a mini PC. In addition, the Cinebench score here is pretty impressive for a CPU like this. We got just under 17,000. And that's definitely on the high end of the 7840HS chipset. In fact, that performance is similar to the upgraded version, which is the 7940HS. So overall, I'm pretty impressed. We've got some great performance, and then also the temperatures are super low, but just bear in mind that the cooling profile is a little bit on the loud side. Now, I also ran a TimeSpy score. This is going to be a GPU intensive test, and the score here is above average for this chipset. I usually would see it around 3,000, but you can see here we're at 3,251. And the reason why this overall score is above average is because of the power profile on that CPU. Because we're getting a full 70 watts of power pumped into it, we're getting a CPU score that's just under 11,000. Now, jumping ahead a little bit, I did plug everything up into my external GPU with OCulink, and you can see here that the score with the external GPU is also above average. In fact, it's the best among all the other things I've tested with this external GPU. Now, the CPU score is even higher now. It's over 11,000. And because we have those external graphics, we've got much higher scores overall. In fact, this is 3 times higher. The average when I was using the GPD G1 in my review video was about 9,000. So the fact that it's getting almost 10,000 is really impressive. Anyway, that's about it when it comes to synthetic benchmarks. I don't like to spend a lot of time with the numbers. Instead, I like to talk about real-world performance. We're going to start with just the mini PC plugged into HDMI, so not the external GPU, and we'll start with lightweight PC games and work our way up. To start with something like Cult of the Lamb at 1080p in medium settings, you can see we're getting an average well over 100 frames per second. I would say it's very close to 120. So if you do want to play this game at a high frame rate, this will be great, but you could also up the settings to like Ultra and then drop it down to 60 frames per second instead. Either way, you've got a lot of room to work with this game. Next up, we're going to try an Xbox 360 era game. This is BioShock Infinite at 1080p in high settings. And here I got an average frame rate of about 110 frames per second. So again, this is performing really well. Let's move over to something a little bit harder to run. So we'll start with Rise of the Tomb Raider at 1080p in low settings. Here I've gone ahead and turned on VSync so that it'll cap out at 60 frames per second. But the point I want to make here is that it is a very stable experience. For example, the thermal profile here is only about 42 watts, so it's not even pushing it super hard. And as you can see, even in some of the more harder to play scenes, it's still running at a pretty stable 60 frames per second. It does dip down every once in a while to like 58, but it's not something that I actually noticed when playing the game. Another game that's really hard to play with integrated graphics is Control. This is a game I generally will have to drop down to 1080p low or 720p settings in order to run well. But you can see here I'm actually running it at 1080p medium settings, so a step above low, and this is definitely running well. I'd say an average of about 35 frames per second. So it's not going to be a full 60 frames per second experience, but this is a very hard game to run. So this is one of those games I would probably just lock at 30 frames per second to enjoy a more console-like experience. Next, we have Doom Eternal. We're going to run this at 1080p medium settings, and I'm going to turn the VSync off here, so you might see a little bit of tearing, but I want to see how high the frame rates can get. And as you can see, the average frame rate is about 80 frames per second, so that is really impressive as well. And this does give us a lot of flexibility, so we could drop it down to low settings and get an even higher frame rate. And with this game, 1080p low still looks very good. That high resolution will compensate for a lot. And then of course, if you want even better graphics, you could use 1080p high, but then probably lock it at 60 frames per second instead. Next, we're going to try God of War 1080p low settings. And generally with integrated graphics, the best I can usually expect at these settings is about an average of 40 frames per second. However, you can see here that we're getting an average of about 50 instead. So yes, the performance here is really good considering the fact that we have integrated graphics. This is a hard game to run. Next up, we have Baldur's Gate 3. We're going to do 1080p medium settings. The average frame rate here is about 35 frames per second, so this is one of those where I'd probably lock it at 30. And I think with this type of game, I think it's going to be a really nice experience. Finally, on the PC side, let's talk about Cyberpunk 2077. We're going to run this at 1080p low settings with no FSR or anything. In fact, with all these games, I'm not using any FSR, so this is all running natively. Either way, you can see here the average frame rate is about 50, maybe 55 frames per second with Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p low. And to me, this is a very playable experience as well. Okay, next I want to jump into emulation. We're not even going to mess with the low-end systems, so things like GameCube and PS2 and below, these will all run fine. In fact, GameCube and PS2, we can play at a 4K resolution on this machine, so it's pretty impressive. Either way, we're going to jump right into Gen 7 with Xbox 360. Now this is running at the native resolution, which is going to be 720p for this game, but you can see here it's running at a very stable 30 frames per second, which is the native speed as well. Same thing with Forza Horizon. This is one of the harder Xbox 360 games to emulate, and so it will dip down to like 28 frames per second here and there, and maybe a couple stutters every once in a while, but overall I would say this is still a very playable experience. So if you are looking to emulate Xbox or Xbox 360, as long as it's compatible with the emulator, you should get some really good performance here. Next up, we'll jump into PS3, and I'm really going to focus on the harder to play games. So for example, we're going to use Prince of Persia. This is an open world game, so it is pretty taxing on the system, and I've also gone ahead and unlocked the frame rate, so it can go all the way up to 60. Now natively, this game actually ran at 30 frames per second, so this is going to be a much more upgraded experience. And while it doesn't hit 60 100% of the time, it is probably the average, and you'll see some dips down below to about 55 frames per second here and there. Either way, this is definitely an upgraded experience if you do want to play a game like this on the PS3. And then finally for PS3, let's try out God of War 3. We're running this one at the native resolution, and I'm using the recommended settings from the RPCS3 wiki page. And here you can see I'm getting well above 30 frames per second. I would say the average here is about 38, maybe 40 frames. And bear in mind, this is the first time I'm playing the scene with this emulator, so it's still compiling shaders as I'm going. And so again, I would say this is a very playable experience, and this is one of the hardest games to run on the PS3 emulator, so that's a good indicator that many of these games are going to run great. And then finally, our last emulated system is going to be Nintendo Switch. We're going to use the Yuzu Early Access app, and we're running all these games in full docked mode. And sure enough, all these games are running great. Link's Awakening, Mario RPG, as well as Super Mario Odyssey. And this is one of the hardest games to run on the system, and so if this is running at a full stable 60 frames per second, this means that a lot of other Switch games are going to run great. Finally, it's our last test. We're going to try this random open world game, and I'm running this at a 720p resolution with a 30 frames per second cap. And I would say on average, 30 frames is probably going to be about it, maybe 28, 29 instead, but all the same, it is a relatively smooth experience. And also bear in mind that I'm compiling a lot of shaders at the same time. This is definitely one of those games that the longer you play it, the better it'll get. So if you do sink a couple hours into the game, it's going to run nice and smooth. Either way, yes, when it comes to emulation, no matter what you throw at it, it's going to be great. Okay, next we're going to try out the OCulink port. Now this is the GPD-G1 external GPU, and I've made a whole dedicated review about it. I'll actually leave it linked down below. In fact, I've actually had this mini PC for a few weeks at this point, but I waited until I had the GPD-G1 and I had fully tested it because I wanted to use it as part of this video review as well. So connecting everything up is pretty easy. We're going to connect the USB 4 port first, and this is going to give us all the data transfer we need from the GPD dock. And then of course for the graphics interface, we're going to plug in the OCulink port, and that's really it. We're good to go. We're going to turn on the dock and then turn on the mini PC after that, and it worked right out of the gate. First time up, I plugged it in and everything was working flawlessly. Now the only hiccup I had was that it did come up with the BitLocker recovery screen, and this does happen every time you plug and unplug that OCulink port. Now this is a pretty easy fix. If you've already registered your mini PC with your Microsoft account, then you can go on a different computer, log into your Microsoft account, and then pull up your BitLocker codes. From there, you just type it in and it'll be good to go. Just bear in mind, you'll have to do that again when you unplug it, or if you want to bypass all of this recovery stuff, you can just go into the BIOS and disable it. Either way, it is a minor inconvenience when you do plug this back and forth, so it's one of those things where you're probably going to want to leave it permanently one way or the other. Anyway, let's move on to the game testing. We'll try a couple lightweight games just for fun. So for example, here with Ryzen Chase Turbo, we're getting an average of about 625 frames per second. I don't know about you, but I don't have a monitor that can go that high. This one only goes to 144 Hertz, but obviously you have a lot of headroom with this game. And it's going to be a similar experience with other games like Hades. This one runs at an average about 400 frames per second, so well above what we would ever need. Now, one thing to note is the USB 4 port on the GPD-G1 will actually power the UM780 mini PC. However, just bear in mind it only has a full 65 watt power delivery, and this mini PC requires more. So if you're playing lightweight games or just doing regular browsing, then yes, you don't need your power brick. But if you want to do any sort of higher end gaming, then you're definitely going to want to have the full brick because it will result in a crash. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on and do some testing with this external dock. We're going to start with Horizon Zero Dawn. Now this is just running natively, so I don't have the GPU hooked up. And you can see here that the game runs at 1080p low settings with an average frame rate about 40-45 frames per second. And again, that's really great performance with integrated graphics. Now going back to the GPD-G1, here's the same game but running at 1080p high settings. And the performance requirement differences between high and low on Horizon Zero Dawn is pretty significant. Even so, it's kind of hard to see, but the average frame rate is about 90 frames per second with this setup right here. So this is a game you could definitely play at 1440p if you wanted to lock it at 60 frames instead. Up next we have Marvel Spider-Man Remastered. Now this is going back to the mini PC without the GPU, and you can see that at 1080p low settings we're getting an average about 40 frames per second. And again, this is great performance. Bear in mind that Spider-Man has a lower setting than low, it's very low. So 1080p low actually looks very good in this game. And now going back to that OCulink setup, we're going to go 1080p very high, which is the very highest graphics settings available with this game. And you can see here that the average frame rate is around 90 frames per second again. Now the monitor I'm testing with caps out at 1080p resolution, but I did test it on a 4K monitor off screen, and I was able to play it at 1440p high settings and a stable 60 frames per second. And I gotta say, it was a great experience. And then finally, the last game we're going to test with this setup is going to be Witcher 3. Now at 1080p low settings, it's still pretty good. I'd say the average frame rate is about 45 frames per second. Again, this is a very playable experience. And the results here with the OCulink are very similar. 1080p ultra settings, so the very highest it can go, and we are getting an average frame rate of about 90 frames per second. So in all, if you do want to use an external GPU like the GPD-G1, I would expect to be able to play 1440p gaming with this mini PC. And the thing I love about this kind of setup is that these two combined are still way smaller than a full desktop PC, and so I really like this kind of small and compact option. Anyway, if you want to learn more about the GPD-G1 and why I like it so much, I'll leave that video linked down below. Finally, the last thing I want to test is Batocera performance. A while back earlier this year, I made a full guide about how to transform a mini PC into a gaming console. And in that video, I showed you how to load up Batocera and then put all your games on it and then kind of consolify the whole experience. And so I also did that here with this mini PC, but using a USB flash drive. And here we're booting into the latest version of Batocera, and as you can see, I've kind of got a console-like experience. I can navigate through all my retro systems, and then I can go within each of these systems, pick out my game, and then start it up from here. And so this is great if you want a Linux-based operating system that is dedicated to retro gaming. And the performance here is also great, so let's play Ratchet & Clank at a 3x resolution, which is about 1440p. And as you can see, yeah, it's running flawlessly, absolutely no problems here. And you can throw all the systems on here, including Wii U, and you can even sideload Nintendo Switch if you'd like. Either way, all these are going to run just as well as they did on Windows, so it's really great to see. And the nice thing here is that Batocera worked from day one. I didn't have to do any special configuration, I just had to put in my flash drive and then boot it. So this is yet another example of what you can do with a mini PC like the UM780. Alright, I think that's enough when it comes to testing. Let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about this one. Number one, I like the design here. It is small, compact, but is still kind of nondescript as well. I also like the fact that you've got two different design options. You can either just use it as a regular mini PC on your desktop, or you can use the stand for a smaller footprint. And of course, as we saw throughout all of our testing, the performance here is really good, well above average, and probably the best with this chipset that I've seen so far. Not only can it play just about every game I threw at it, but some of these frame rates are really good. And of course, thanks to that OCulink port, we can expand it even further, so you can plug in an external GPU and get a full transfer speed. And so really when it comes down to it, the sky's the limit. You can play any emulated system and then any PC game as well. It's kind of amazing that we're even getting performance like this with such a small form factor. Another thing I appreciated about this one is the I/O placement. I love the fact that we have both USB-C and USB-A ports on the front. This will allow us to plug in something simple up front, like a controller or a USB keyboard, but we've also got all the good ports on the back too, so if you want to plug in an external drive, you can kind of hide it out of the way. I'm also a fan of all the video output options that we have. Both the USB 4 ports are capable of 4K output, but then we also have HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4 on the back. So no matter what kind of video connectivity options you want, you've got it here. And in general, I think that's one of my favorite things about the UM780 XTX is the fact that we have just lots of options. In addition to all the ports, we've also got an OCulink in the back. And like I mentioned earlier, you can either just set it on its side or put it on a stand or even mount it to the back of a monitor. And so I really appreciate the fact that this is probably one of the most versatile mini PCs on the market right now. Now, of course, nothing is perfect, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the things I didn't like about the UM780 XTX. Number one are the RGB options. Like, I like the fact that they have this idea going, but as it stands right now, all you have is the tiger design. And personally, I don't really have an affinity for tigers to the point where I want to put them on my computer. So I think it would have been really neat if they had some sort of design studio within their website where you could like make your own, maybe a Retro Game Core logo, put something like that on it. And so I hope that's something that they implement down the line, but yeah, for right now, I'm not really seeing it. But thankfully you're able to turn it off in the settings. Another thing that kind of bothered me about it is that you have to make a choice between additional storage or that OCulink port, because we've only got that one additional M.2 slot and no SATA connection either. And so if you do want to use OCulink, you're really going to be limited to just that one M.2 slot, which means you're going to have to buy a pretty big drive. And of course that can all be mitigated by using external drives, but all the same I'd rather it be self-contained. So it's definitely something where you'll have to make a sacrifice if you are going to use that OCulink hookup. Additionally, as we showed in my testing, it's not super quiet. It's not the loudest one I've ever heard, but it is definitely up there. So if you are looking for something that's very quiet, I would say this is not ideal. However, we are having to contend with the laws of physics, and because this thing is so small and powerful, something has to give. And I think among all the different components, it's the fan volume that had to make the sacrifice. And then finally, this is a point I put in almost all my mini PC reviews. The price here is not going to be comparable to a desktop PC. But of course, bear in mind, this is only a fraction of the size of a full desktop PC. And so there is a little bit of give and take there. Yes, you can definitely get more bang for your buck, but size is going to be the issue at that point. And so when it comes down to it, I'm a big fan of the UM780 XTX. I think among all the other high-end mini PCs, this is the one to get. And it's always funny because every time they release one of these, that one's going to be the best one. And so in the end, this one just kind of stands on the shoulders of the others that I've recommended previously. As always, it's going to come down to what your budget is and what kind of power you're looking for. And to help you along the way, I've got a full mini PC review spreadsheet. This lists out all of the 30 plus PCs that I've reviewed and what performance you can expect at the various price points. And yeah, I would say that at this $630 price point when it's fully spec'd, this actually dethrones the Beelink SCR7, which I had previously recommended. And the performance between the two is pretty similar, but I love the fact that the MinisForum one will go to a full 70 watt TDP. In addition, I love all the little things here, that all the ports are correctly placed, and that we have the option of using OCulink if you want it. So long story short, if you are in the market for a mini PC and you want something at the high end, I think if you're within this budget, this is the one to get. However, if this is a little bit expensive for your taste, that's totally understandable. I would say keep an eye out for it and see if it's going to go down in price in the future, or check out some of the other budget options I have available on my spreadsheet. Each one of these that are listed has a full review video as well. So let me know what you think about the UM780 XTX in the comments down below, and as always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.